In June 1629, the jewel of the Dutch East India Company fleet smashed into a reef off the Australian coast, stranding over 300 people on a cluster of barren islands. Within weeks, around 125 men, women, and children would be murdered in what became one of the most horrific mutinies in maritime history. The survivors weren't killed by starvation, thirst, or exposure. They were systematically slaughtered by their fellow castaways in a reign of terror that makes most horror films look tame. This is the story of the Batavia, where a shipwreck was just the beginning of the nightmare. The Batavia departed from the Netherlands in October 1628, carrying not just cargo worth millions in today's currency, but also high-ranking officials, soldiers, and entire families seeking fortune in the Dutch East Indies. Francisco Pelsart, the ship's commander, was a respected merchant with years of experience in the spice trade. Under him served Arjen Jacobsen, the ship's skipper, a capable but arrogant sailor who had grown to despise Pelsart during the voyage. Among the 341 passengers and crew was Jeronimus Cornelisz, an apothecary fleeing bankruptcy and scandal in Haarlem, whose charisma and education made him stand out among the common sailors. Also aboard was Lucretia Jans, a beautiful young woman traveling with her husband to join him in the Indies. Her presence would spark events that set the stage for catastrophe. But tensions were already brewing before the ship even reached the open ocean. And by the time they sailed past the Cape of Good Hope, the Batavia was carrying something far more dangerous than its precious cargo. The voyage had been plagued with problems from the start, but the real trouble began when Jacobsen and Cornelisz formed an unlikely alliance based on their mutual hatred of Commander Pelsart. The two men spent their evenings drinking and plotting, with Cornelisz whispering ideas about mutiny and seizing the ship's treasure for themselves. Their plan was audacious. They would orchestrate an attack on Lucretia Jans, betting that Pelsart's response would give them grounds to turn the crew against him and take control of the vessel. What kind of men plot such calculated cruelty, and how far were they willing to go? Late one night, a group of sailors actually assaulted Lucretia, then smeared her with tar and filth while she slept on deck, a humiliating violation that left her traumatized and the ship's company divided. Pelsart's investigation went nowhere. Jacobsen protected the perpetrators, and the commander found himself increasingly isolated and powerless aboard his own ship. The tension became unbearable as the Batavia sailed into the unknown waters off Australia's western coast, and what happened next would make their conspiracy seem like a minor transgression. On the night of June 4th, 1629, while most of the ship's company slept, the Batavia was racing through darkness at full sail. The lookout told Jacobsen they were approaching shallow waters, but the captain decided this was a trick of the light of the moon. Around 4 in the morning, the watchman spotted white foam ahead, breaking waves that meant only one thing: reef. Before anyone could react, the Batavia slammed into coral with a sickening crunch that tore through the hull and jolted every soul aboard from their hammocks. The massive ship lurched to a halt, impaled on the reef, waves crashing over the deck as water poured into the lower holds. In the chaos and darkness, passengers scrambled for their lives while the ship began to break apart, and Commander Pelsart realized that their nightmare was just beginning. The Batavia had struck Morning Reef, part of the Houtman Abrolhos Islands, approximately 40 miles off the coast of Western Australia, a region so remote and uncharted that few Europeans even knew it existed. As dawn broke, the survivors faced a horrifying reality. They were marooned on a chain of small, waterless coral islands with limited supplies. Pelsart managed to evacuate most of the passengers and crew to nearby Beacon Island and other small outcrops, but the ship itself was stuck fast and breaking apart in the surf. Over the next few days, they salvaged what they could: food, water casks, timber, and weapons, but it was clear that their situation was desperate. The islands offered almost nothing: no fresh water, minimal vegetation, and no shelter from the elements. But what nobody realized yet was that shortage of resources would be the least of their problems. Faced with impossible choices, Commander Pelsart made a fateful decision that would seal the fate of those left behind. He would take the ship's longboat, along with Jakobsen and a skeleton crew of around 40 men, and sail 2,000 miles north to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, to organize a rescue mission. It was a desperate gamble. The journey would take weeks through treacherous waters, but it was their only hope for salvation. On June 8th, just 4 days after the wreck, Pelsart departed, leaving approximately 268 survivors scattered across the barren islands under the temporary command of the senior merchant aboard. That merchant's name was Jeronimus Cornelisz, the bankrupt apothecary with a charming smile and dark ambitions. What Pelsart didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just handed absolute power to a psychopath. Within days of Pelsart's departure, Cornelisz began implementing a plan so calculated and ruthless that it still shocks historians today. He had no intention of ensuring everyone's survival until rescue arrived. Instead, he saw the situation as an opportunity to eliminate witnesses, seize the Batavia's salvaged treasure, and escape with a small group of loyal followers when a ship eventually arrived. Using his cunning, education, and charisma, Cornelisz quickly established himself as leader, dividing the survivors into groups and sending the strongest men, including soldiers who might oppose him, to distant islands under the pretense of searching for water. These men were essentially exiled, and Cornelisz made sure they received minimal provisions, hoping they would die from thirst or starvation before they could interfere with his plans. But for those who remained on Beacon Island under his direct control, something far worse was in store. Cornelisz recruited a core group of psychopathic followers from among the sailors and soldiers, men who were either desperate enough or cruel enough to do whatever he commanded. He promised them treasure, women, and survival, but first they needed to reduce the number of mouths to feed. What followed was systematic murder, dressed up as necessity. The killings began with the weak. The sick were quietly drowned or strangled. Then came the elderly and those who questioned Cornelisson's authority. Families were separated and killed in the night, their bodies thrown into the ocean. Witnesses were eliminated before they could spread word of the atrocities. The death toll climbed from dozens to over 100, and still the murders continued with increasing brutality and sadism. Cornelisz had created his own kingdom of terror, where he held power of life and death, and where his followers competed to prove their loyalty through increasingly horrific acts. But Cornelisz had made a critical miscalculation. The soldiers he had exiled to the distant islands hadn't died. Led by Weeb Hayes, a junior officer with natural leadership abilities, these men had actually found fresh water on their islands and had survived, even thrived. When Hayes learned through a captured messenger what was happening on Beacon Island, he knew they had to act. With only a handful of men armed with improvised weapons against Cornelisson's well-equipped force, Hayes fortified his position and prepared to defend the innocent. When Cornelisz finally sent boats to eliminate Hayes and his men, they met unexpected resistance. The soldiers fought back fiercely, repelling multiple attacks and even capturing some of Cornelisson's key lieutenants. The tyrant who had murdered with impunity suddenly found himself facing organized opposition, and his reign of terror began to crumble. The timing of Hayes's resistance was providential, because on 17th September 1629, more than 3 months after the wreck, a sail appeared on the horizon. Commander Pelsart had accomplished the impossible. He had sailed 2,000 miles in an open boat to Batavia, secured a rescue ship, and returned to the Abrolhos Islands. But as the rescue vessel approached, Pelsart noticed something bizarre. Men on the islands were signaling frantically, and there appeared to be 2 armed groups. When Cornelisz and his followers rowed out to greet the ship, planning to kill Pelsart and seize the vessel, they were met with a devastating surprise. Hayes's men had already reached Pelsart and told him everything. The mutineers were captured immediately, their weapons confiscated, and Cornelisson's nightmare kingdom came to an abrupt end. The full scope of the horror gradually emerged during Pelsart's investigation. Of the approximately 268 people left behind, around 125 had been murdered. Men, women, and children systematically killed over the course of nearly 4 months. Survivors testified to unspeakable cruelty, people tortured before being killed, infants murdered in front of their mothers, sexual assault used as a weapon of control. Pelsart, a man of strict Dutch justice, wasted no time. Trials were conducted aboard the rescue ship, with overwhelming evidence from multiple witnesses. 7 of the worst perpetrators, including Cornelisz, were hanged on makeshift gallows erected on one of the islands. Before his execution, Cornelisz's hands were cut off, punishment for the blood they had spilled. 2 of his accomplices, judged to have been lesser offenders, were marooned on the Australian mainland instead of being executed, becoming possibly the first Europeans to permanently inhabit Australia. The remaining mutineers were taken back to Batavia to face additional punishment. Justice had finally arrived, but it came far too late for the innocent victims whose deaths could have been prevented. The wreck of the Batavia stands as one of history's darkest maritime disasters, not because of the shipwreck itself, but because of how woefully human nature failed in the aftermath. The lessons from this tragedy remain painfully relevant nearly 4 centuries later. 1. Leadership structure and succession planning are critical in crisis situations. Pelsart's decision to leave the survivors without clear, trustworthy command created a power vacuum that Cornelisz exploited ruthlessly. In any organization facing disaster, whether a shipwreck, corporate crisis, or community emergency, the absence of legitimate authority invites tyranny. When cataclysm strikes, people don't automatically organize into cooperative groups. They need legitimate authority figures who can be held accountable. Pelsart had no good options, but leaving Cornelisz in charge proved to be a fatal mistake that cost over 100 lives. 2. Character assessment matters more than credentials or social class. Cornelisz was educated, articulate, and came from a respectable background, exactly the type of person 17th century Dutch society would consider a natural leader. But his veneer of civilization concealed a dangerous personality that revealed itself only when constraints were removed. The disaster demonstrates how quickly thin social conventions can collapse when a charismatic individual with dark motives gains unchecked power. 3. Isolation and scarcity amplify the worst human tendencies, but also reveal the best. While Cornelisz used the desperate situation to justify murder, Vibberhaes and his men shared scarce resources and organized effective resistance despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The same circumstances that created one group's reign of terror inspired another group's courageous solidarity. This paradox reveals that survival situations don't determine human behavior, they simply reveal pre-existing character. 4. Speaking up and resistance matter, even when success seems impossible. Several survivors, who later testified, tried to resist Cornelisz's orders or speak out against the murders, but were quickly silenced. Yet Hayes and his small group, seemingly powerless on distant islands, refused to accept Cornelisz's version of reality and ultimately saved the remaining survivors. Their resistance, even when appearing futile, proved decisive. This lesson resonates in any context where authority figures abuse power. Silence and compliance enable atrocities, and even small acts of defiance can shift outcomes. The Batavia shows us that those who stand against evil, even with limited resources and terrible odds, can make the difference between complete tragedy and partial salvation. 5. Accountability and justice, even when delayed, serve essential functions for survivors and society. Pelsart's swift trials and executions provided some measure of closure for traumatized survivors, and sent a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated or forgotten. The detailed records he kept, including testimony from victims and perpetrators, ensured that the truth survived for history. While justice came too late for the murdered victims, it mattered profoundly for those who remained. Modern transitional justice movements understand this, documenting atrocities, holding perpetrators accountable, and acknowledging victims' suffering are crucial for community healing. Archaeological excavations have uncovered remains of victims and artifacts from the wreck, physical evidence of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. In the end, the real tragedy wasn't that the Batavia struck a reef. It was that when disaster removed society's constraints, some people chose murder while others chose sacrifice. That choice, made in isolation on barren islands nearly 400 years ago, echoes through every crisis we face today.